Welcome to another episode of Cultural Caravan Television. I'm Dr. William Seraile. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Gerald Horne, who is the John and Rebecca Moore Chair of History and African American Studies. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Quite welcome, Gerald. Now tell me, what does it mean to have a chair in a university history department?
Well, as your introductory remarks suggested, I'm the Morris Chair at the University of Houston in Texas. Mm-hmm. And fundamentally what it means is that you have research funds because you're supposed to use those research funds to write more books than most faculty do.
Okay, and that's manna from heaven.
It certainly is.
For anyone's trying to do research and got to travel and go to different
Mm-hmm.
archives and so
Mm-hmm.
forth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, today we're going to talk about your new book, 1776, A Counter-Revolution. In 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote Black Reconstruction, mm-hmm. and he challenged the prevailing viewpoint that Reconstruction was a failure. It was a black failure, actually, mm-hmm. of corrupt, incompetent lawmakers. Mm-hmm. And it took maybe about 30-odd years for most historians to come around to his viewpoint, that Reconstruction wasn't a black failure. In the 1940s and 50s, historians like Kenneth Stamp and others began to talk about slavery as slave rebellions, and slaves were not docile people, mm-hmm. and John Blassingame wrote a book around 1972, Slave Community, mm-hmm. saying yes, there was a slave culture. Now, all these studies basically overthrew prevailing viewpoints. Your argument is that America's history is a fraud because it's a fraud because the viewpoint is that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and Madison and all of the so-called American founding fathers established democracy by successfully rebelling against the crown and parliament. You argue that it's a counter-revolution because the real revolution would have been slavery and slavery rebellions. Is this correct?
Well, the real revolution might have led to abolition of slavery,
okay.
For example. One of the arguments that I make in this book, the Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave mm-hmm. Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, is that the rebellion against British rule, exemplified by July 4th, 1776 and the Declaration of Independence, was motivated in no small part by a reluctance to adhere to the fact that Britain was moving steadily towards
Correctly.
Abolition of slavery.
Correctly.
There was Somerset's case in June 1772, mm-hmm. which seemed to suggest that not only would slavery be abolished in England, but the way the law works is that it works on the basis of precedent, and then that would set a precedent that could easily be extended across the Atlantic to North America, which would have jeopardized many fortunes in North America, including this murderous row of founders that you just mentioned, sure. Washington, Jefferson, Patrick Henry, sure. Madison, et al. Now that's the short answer mm-hmm. to your question about what this book is about. The longer answer would have to go back decades to another revolution, that is to say the so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, which involved the rising merchant class, basically stripping the crown, the king, of certain powers, among which was the monopoly over the African slave trade as embodied in the Royal African Company. What happened was deregulation of the African slave trade, what I call free trade in Africans.
So everybody got involved.
More merchants got involved,
sure.
and they descended upon Africa, mm-hmm. the continent, like a herd of maniacal crazed bees, chaining and manacling and handcuffing mm-hmm. every African in sight, dragging them across the Atlantic, mm-hmm. which had multiple consequences. One, it created tremendous wealth. The African slave trade was one of the most lucrative businesses in all of human history, which is one of the reasons why it lasted so long. There were certain voyages where the profit was 1,700%. That is to say, you invest $1 mm-hmm. and you get $1,700 back. Now, you know today, since we're in New York, that there are those who would sell their firstborn for a 1,700% profit, let alone an African they don't know. So great wealth is being created, which I say, along with Walter Rodney of Guyana and How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, or Eric Williams of Trinidad and Tobago and Capitalism and Slavery, that this leads to the takeoff of the system under which we now labor, called capitalism. But on the other hand, it led to rebellions, because particularly in the Caribbean, which until the middle of the 18th century, London saw as more profitable than the North American mainland, not least because the production of sugar, which was not only an item that you could use to sweeten your tea, but also it was seen by many as a miracle drug, believe it or not. And the sugar trade was quite profitable, and it was based upon slave labor. Sugar was made out of blood, used to be the saying back then. But the Europeans were being outnumbered. This leading to slave revolts. The Africans in Jamaica and Antigua in particular are seeking to liquidate the settler class and basically take over, which is what happens with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which we may want to talk about at some point. And what happens is that with the slave revolts and the slave rebellions in the Caribbean, many of the European settlers began to make the great trek to the North American mainland. In fact, when I was in Newport, Rhode Island, and Newport was at one time an epicenter of the African slave trade, the main library there is named after Abraham Redwood, who, after the Africans revolted in Antigua in 1736, like many Europeans, he decided to get out of Dodge and then move to Newport. Parenthesis, the slave trade during this period was mostly financed from the north, Newport, New York, Boston, and then the Africans were brought to the south, Savannah, Charleston, Virginia, etc., which I think tends to erode that easy idea that slavery was all a southern phenomenon, and that the North could wash its hands because it had nothing to do with it. This is fundamentally fallacious. In any case, moving to the North American mainland, as many did not spare these European settlers from slave revolts. You had a major slave revolt in South Carolina, Stono's Revolt, circa 1739. And I should add there that one of the points I bring out that I think is relatively new is that there was much collaboration between the Africans under the British flag and the Africans under the Spanish flag, for example, in Spanish Florida. Spain had taken, Florida, as you know, was controlled by Spain from the early 1500s until about 1820 when the United States takes over. Spain had a different approach to Africans than Britain did. They had been arming Africans as early as the 1500s for various reasons. And armed Africans were coming across the border from Spanish Florida, marauding and pillaging and plundering and trying to stir up revolts, which is outraging the settlers. Indeed, one of the points that I make in this book is that there is competitive pressure on London, on Britain, to move towards a model of development that Spain has, that is to say, to arm more Africans. And of course, that's because, of course, the Spanish are oftentimes getting the best of Britain because they're putting arms in the hands of Africans and they're creating more of a class system where you have more free Negroes in that regard. But of course, the settlers here in the North American mainland under the British flag thought that Africans were for slavery. They weren't, not supposed to put a gun or a rifle in an African's hand. So this is leading to fissures, splits between the Crown in London and the North American mainland. And to fast forward, these sorts of splits fundamentally undergird the revolt against British rule in July 1776, which tend to suggest that the whole story of the United States needs to be rewritten.
Okay, well, let's look briefly at Lord Dunmore, 1775 in Virginia, and what impact did that have on this counter-revolution?
Well, what's happening is that as this conflict and rift between the British officials in places like Virginia, where Lord Dunmore is the colonial governor, that is to say Britain's man in Virginia, this rift between Britain on the one hand and the settlers on the other is coming to a boil in the 1770s. And Lord Dunmore, who is literally being attacked, threatens to unleash the Africans against the settlers. Now, keep in mind that these settlers are breaking the law by revolting against British rule, just like you would be breaking the law if you decide to lead an armed revolt against the United States of America in 2014. And so you have to ask yourselves, well, what would make people break the law and run the risk of being jailed, if not executed, because it was taken quite seriously then, probably more seriously then than it is now. And one of my arguments is that they thought that their slaves were going to be unleashed against them. And this was outrageous, not only in terms of their own mortality, this violated their ethics, it violated their culture, and it helped to drive more and more settlers into the ranks of the rebels, or as they called themselves, the Patriots.
Okay. Now, we know that there were people supporting abolitionism at this time, and certainly in the New England area, slavery was dying out for economic reasons. It wasn't as well entrenched as it was, say, in the Carolinas or Georgia. What role were Quakers playing at this time?
Well, as you know, in terms of U.S. abolitionism, the Quakers were in the vanguard, particularly in the city of Philadelphia, which during this time was probably the leading city over New York on the North American mainland. Although it's fair to say, as indicated in a book I published a couple of years ago, Negro Comrades of the Crown, African Americans in the British Empire Fight the United States Before Emancipation. As I pointed out in that book, U.S. abolitionism was heavily dependent on British abolitionism. Recall that Britain abolishes the slave trade before the United States does, 1807 versus 1808, and it abolishes slavery before the United States does, 1833-34 versus, let's say, 1865. And not only that, but after the United States abolishes the African slave trade, that is to say, bringing Africans from the continent of Africa to the North American mainland, of course, they still have an internal slave trade. As a matter of fact, recent scholarship shows that Virginia is basically a breeding state. They're breeding Africans like you would breed cattle, for example. And then the Africans would oftentimes be sold down the river to that great Walmart of the slave trade, which was New Orleans. But even though supposedly the slave trade was abolished by the United States in 1808, an illegal slave trade erupted. I mean, it's like saying, well, marijuana is against the law, so nobody smokes marijuana. Well, no. I mean, you can have a law against something, but people still engage in the activity. And that was certainly the case with regard to the African slave trade. But what's striking is that there's this de facto alliance in many ways between the black population and London, because the British become the cops on the beat, detaining and deterring U.S. slave vessels who are trying to bring Africans from Angola and the Congo River Basin across the Atlantic, particularly to Brazil. As I point out in my book, The Deepest South, U.S., Brazil, and the African Slave Trade, one of the major reasons why you have so many black people in Brazil more than any place outside of Nigeria is because of the manic energy of these U.S. slave dealers in the 1830s and the 1840s. So even though it's fair to say that abolitionism was a movement of some magnitude in the United States, I would say that number one, it's heavily dependent on British abolitionism from just about every point of view, that is to say, from the point of view of rhetoric, from the point of view of funding, et cetera. And number two, it's understandable why you had an abolitionist movement in this country, because this country was like the main scofflaw when it comes to the question of violating the bans against the international slave trade.
Okay, now, we have so-called heroes in America. We have cities, counties, schools, bridges, etc., named after George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, and so forth. So what's your reply to your critics who say, oh, Dr. Horne, that's a polemical study, and it's not really based on intellectual discovery. So what kind of resources did you use that might be different from, say, previous interpretations of American?
I'm glad you asked that question. First of all, I'm glad you had the preface that you did by mentioning Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, because the implication of your wise remark about Du Bois is that our interpretations of history change for various reasons that need not detain us here. History is not a static phenomenon. In fact, there are those who say that our only obligation to history is to rewrite it. Point number two is that, surprisingly and shockingly enough, a lot of these writers, scholars who write about colonial North America, number one, many of them don't talk about slavery. Or if they do, they sort of cabin slavery. You know, they'll have all the hagiography about Washington and Jefferson, et cetera. And then they'll mention it in a paragraph. But sadly and unfortunately, there were slaves. But back to the hero story, you see. And then number two is that many of these scholars, they don't go to London to do research. I mean, the North American mainland was ruled from London ostensibly before 1776. It would be as if you're writing a history of Puerto Rico in the 20th century and not understanding that after the U.S. war against Spain in 1898, the United States took over Puerto Rico. I mean, it's a colony. And so therefore, to understand Puerto Rico, you'd have to do some sort of study in the United States of America. So I did lots of research, not only in the British archives, the National Archives of the UK, but in the British Library. And I also was able to call upon the research that I had done for other books. I mentioned the book on Brazil, where I did research in Lisbon, which Portugal, of course, was one of the major centers for the African slave trade. And right after this book came out, I did a book on Cuba, which necessitated doing research in Spain. And I was just talking about Spain's role in terms of colonial North America. So I think that's part of what this book brings to the table.
Okay, so when George Washington said, quote, "There's not a man alive more sincerely than I am who wishes to see some form adopted to abolish slavery in Virginia." And he died owning slaves. Thomas Jefferson, talked about slavery is this great evil, and he said, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and that justice cannot sleep forever. And one day slavery is going to cause like a fireball erupting in the night."
Well,
so they call them hypocrites, I guess.
Well, I would say that their thoughts were illuminated by the fires of Hispaniola. That is to say, the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, sent a frisson of apprehension coursing down the spines of many of these slaveholders in the United States of America, Thomas Jefferson not least, because what they came to recognize was that the Africans could revolt, and not only would you lose your property in Africans, you might lose your life. And I think that kind of reality really shook up Jefferson in particular. My next book is going to be on the Haitian Revolution, which is why I keep talking about it. And I start the book a few days after August 1791, when the Africans erupt in Hispaniola, what is now Haiti. And George Washington is quaking in his boots. I'm quoting his letters, quoting his correspondence. And so, understandably, they're very much concerned about the fate and future of slavery, just like they were concerned about the fate and future of their own lives.
Okay. Now, obviously, as a historian, you're writing for historians, but also...
Only to a degree.
To a degree, but also you, like other historians, hope that, particularly with the controversial interpretation, that one day is going to find itself maybe in the average classroom across America. Do you foresee this? Because we have Texas and California that adopt books on the state level, and Texas has recently, certainly basically almost dismissed the fact that there's Africans in America in terms of history and interpretation.
What you said about Texas is very unfortunate. It's unfortunate not only because it does an injustice to history, but it's unfortunate also because a textbook publisher will have to pay attention to what happens in the second largest state, that is to say Texas, and won't want to write a textbook for Texas alone and then another one for the other 49 states. And so then therefore the Texas misinterpretation might become the reigning misinterpretation, if you like. So this is very tragic indeed. With regard to the 1776 book, to a degree it's written for historians, but since I'm flagrantly contradicting what they think and believe, it would have been folly to pitch it solely at them. And I'm happy to say that this book has found an audience amongst many black people in particular. I've gotten a very strong and resonant response from black Americans in particular. In part, I think because unlike these other historians and histories where you would never know that there was slavery in the United States of America before 1776, or these histories that make the black people seem like they're chumps. That is to say, like the Hollywood movie with Mel Gibson, The Patriot, where you would think that the slaves are cheering on their slave masters as their slave masters prevail and therefore can tighten the handcuffs on their wrists. You know? So that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, you kind of partially answered my next question because I was, historians write books and then it may take a year or long before it's reviewed in Journal of American History or American Historical Review. Have you had an opportunity to be confronted by historians, whether it's on blogs or talk shows?
Oh, sure. Yeah, oh, sure. I mean, mostly in blogs. You can all interested viewers and listeners can just go to the internet and you'll be able to find it. But one of the things I found, a lot of people haven't really read the book. They just hear about the thesis, and it so flagrantly contradicts what they think that they feel compelled to say that they don't like what I'm saying. But I suggest that they look at the book, maybe look at the resources, look at the footnotes, et cetera. And as you know, this is published by University Press, New York University Press,
Sure.
which means that it has to be peer-reviewed.
Sure.
And therefore, the specialists in the field combed through a book like this with a fine-tooth comb, and some of them were courageous enough to put their endorsement on the back of the book. So we shall see, but I'm not that worried.
Okay. Now, so the counter-revolution in 1776, how does that relate to the growing conservative movement today in America?
Very good question. Number one of the reasons I decided to research this book is, like any other black person, I'm trying to understand what's going on. I'm trying to understand the study of the Department of Education, which suggests that black preschoolers are suspended and disciplined at a rate spectacularly higher than other preschoolers. I'm trying to understand studies that suggest that black pedestrians are more likely to be mowed down by cars as they're going through a crosswalk. I'm trying to understand why black people are perhaps the most highly incarcerated and imprisoned people on planet Earth. I'm trying to understand our spectacularly higher rates of unemployment. And it seems to me that you have to go back to the beginning of the story of our journey in North America. And you have to understand that the revolt against British rule was at loggerheads with the struggle against slavery. And that in many ways, 1776 was a revolt to ensure freedom to enslave. And so therefore, it's no accident and surprise that the descendants of mainland enslaved Africans continued to be treated so atrociously, because the country in many ways was built on not only on their enslavement, but the desire to perpetuate their enslavement. So I think that helps to understand and helps to undergird and underpin why you have this highly racialized conservatism in 2014, where the Republican Party is basically the party of whiteness, so to speak, and where even today, even though we've achieved major victories in the past 50 years in trying to make official doctrine the idea that racism is not acceptable, but we all know, just like with laws, that there's official doctrine on the one hand and there's praxis on the other. And certainly for those who are paying attention to what just happened in Ferguson, Missouri, for example, have reason to understand and believe how and why it is it's so difficult for we people who are darker than blue to receive constitutional protection in 2014, not least because the country was founded upon the basis of our own enslavement.
Okay, we're coming to the conclusion of our episode here, and certainly people who are watching the program can always check their credits if they want to contact you and ask you either directly about the book itself.
Absolutely.
And in conclusion, you've written, 30 books?
Some in that ballpark.
Okay. So how would you like your legacy to be known as a historian?
Wow. I hadn't thought about that question.
Well, think fast.
I don't know. I mean, hopefully that I helped to contribute, along with many others, to illuminating obscure and important corners of the history, not only of the United States, but of Africa, the Caribbean, of Latin America, etc.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gerald. And it's been some time since I've seen you in New York, so don't be a stranger.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.